Welcome to the second day of Wisconsin Water Week and to Tuesday's Habitat session. I want to take a moment to thank our sponsors in this morning's session, Wisconsin Lake and Pond Resources, LLC. My name is Jessica Hockey and I'll be the moderator for this session. I want to mention a couple things before we get started. Our speaker will be able to answer some questions if there's time after his talk. At the top right-hand side of your screen, you'll see a chat tab and a Q&A tab. If you would like to ask our speaker a question, use the Q&A tab to type that in, because I cannot see the chat side of things. So just make sure you use that Q&A session that Q&A tab. And you can also vote for questions, and the more votes a question gets, the more likely I will ask that question to our speaker. Okay, our last speaker for this morning's session is Greg Matzke. Greg is a fisheries biologist with the Wisconsin DNR who manages the fisheries in Florence and Forest Counties. And his talk today is titled, "The Fight to Maintain Quality Walleye Fisheries in Forest and Florence Counties." So Greg, I'll go ahead and you can share your screen and take it away.
All right, thank you very much. I'm assuming everyone can see my screen and my video here, but my name is Greg Matzke. I'm a fisheries biologist with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. I work way up in the northeast corner of Wisconsin. My office is in Florence, and I cover all the waters in Florence County as well as Forest County. And my talk today is basically on some very unique projects that we've been doing over the last decade up here to try to fight to maintain quality walleye fishing in these two counties. And it's been a tougher task than one would think. And we've been fortunate to be able to pull off some of these more aggressive projects. And some of them now, we have some good results that have been coming in, and others are just in the early stages of the project. So we're going to go through all of those today, so I can show you what we've been up to up here. So today we're going to talk about our bullhead removal projects, which have occurred on Lake Matanga, Patton Lake, Crane Lake, and Pickerel Lake. Patton Lake is in Florence County. The others are in Forest County. These projects have been ongoing for the longest amount of time. Lake Matanga was started in 2008, Patton Lake in 2011, Crane Lake in 2013, and Pickerel Lake in 2014. So, like I mentioned before, we're in different stages of these projects. We're starting to get some really good results in on some of these that have been going on longer, and some are more in the early phases. But I want to go through those projects, explain what we did, the preliminary impacts that we're seeing, and then after that, we'll shift gears a little bit into a walleye rehabilitation project started in 2013 on Jungle Lake. And then our most recent project, which is on Roberts Lake, and that's yellow perch and walleye rehabilitation. Let's see here. Okay, so Lake Matanga, for those of you that aren't familiar, it's right just south of the town of Crandon. So the north shore there, you can see in this aerial photo, is the town of Crandon. It's the largest lake in Forest County at just under 2,000 acres. Fairly deep lake. It has a deep basin down in the southeast that gets almost 80 feet deep. A lot of the lake is in that 25 to 30 foot range. Very clear water. Zebra mussels are present. Preliminary hard sand substrate. It's just a large lake. It's a lot of recreation activity, and it's not one that you would normally think of as having a high abundance of bullheads. Normally we think of bullheads in these shallower lakes where oxygen may be an issue, but this is pretty much a deep, clear lake, large, deep, clear lake where bullheads became a problem. So this project, I got to give the kudos to the Mole Lake Chippewa community. They have a fisheries program that is top-notch, has state-of-the-art equipment. They run a hatchery, they run full fisheries operations, and their presence in Forest County is what's allowed me to pull off a lot of these projects. Without their help, we wouldn't be doing probably any of these projects. They've almost all been a collaborative effort. We maintain a great relationship with them, and they're great stewards of the resource. And so their biologist, who's now their director of fisheries, Mike Proyle, started this project in 2008. And the problem that we'd been seeing, so the long history of Lake Matanga, the first walleye population estimates started in the late 80s. And you can see that when they started, we had walleye populations around 2.5 adults per acre. Walleyes have been present in the system for many decades prior to that, and it's always been kind of marginally successful. We've had to stock walleyes to maintain a fishery. While there has been limited amounts of natural reproduction, stocking is basically what's fueled this fishery. And as you can see from the late 90s, kind of down into the mid to late 2000s, we had a major drop in adult walleye population, or adult walleye abundance, going from a high of almost 4 per acre in the late 90s down to a population of less than 1 adult per acre during the 2000s. And during this time where the walleye population was declining, Mike with the tribe had seen an influx of black bullheads, where they became very abundant. They were kind of all over the place during all surveys. And he kind of did this pilot study where he looked at removing black bullheads and seeing what impact it would have on the fishery. Originally, he just felt like these are a less desirable fish species and they're accounting for a lot of the biomass in this lake, but and just hope to remove them and see some positive impacts of desirable fish species. You know, obviously, everyone hopes for increases in the walleye population, but we weren't sure that was going to happen. So this was the problem that was facing Lake Matanga during the 2000s. And we measure walleye recruitment by doing fall electrofishing surveys. In the fall of the year, we'll electrofish near shore when water temps are between 55 and 65 degrees. The age 0 walleye, or those walleyes that were hatched that year, will move near shore and they'll be very vulnerable to electrofishing. And we'll circle the entire lake, and we'll collect all the juvenile walleyes that we can, and then we assess their abundance by looking at the number that we caught per mile. And so this chart here shows walleye recruitment from 1998 to 2007, and we have the stocked year classes are these white or hollow bars, and the black filled in bars are years where we didn't stock. So as you can see, there was some natural reproduction going on, but not too much, and stocking was mainly propping up the system with an average of about 13 per mile of these age 0 walleyes coming back in falls of years that we stocked, and just under 3 per mile in years that we did not stock. And just to give you a better understanding, right about here at about 20 per mile, that's what we often consider to be a significant year class, meaning if we have over 20 age 0 walleyes per mile during these surveys, we'll end up seeing them as adults. They'll add to the population. Under 20, generally not many of them survive, or not in a large enough number to impact the adult abundance. So kind of our target goal for a good year is this 20 per mile. And we only have to hit that about once every 4 or 5 years in order to maintain a solid walleye population. But you can see with stocking and natural reproduction, we only had one good year in 2002 that led to some improvements to the adult walleye population. And so in 2008, Mike started his project where he was removing black bullheads from Lake Matanga. We call the period from 2008 to 2010 his initial removals, where they were very abundant, and he really had to make a major change to the bullhead abundance. And he did all of his removals with our electrofishing boat, which you can see in the upper right here. In the other ones we'll talk about, I used a couple of different gears to try to remove bullheads, but this is what worked best on Lake Matanga. And then after 2010, removals continued out to 2017 with less fish being removed from the lake, but we call these the maintenance removals. So in total, we ended up removing, or Mike ended up removing about 32,000 black bullheads from Lake Matanga. And so again, this is the walleye recruitment prior to the bullhead removal, which took place in 2008. And this is the same data that you saw before. Notice that the scale has changed here a bit. But again, we're looking at that about 20 per mile target to have a year class that'll actually impact and improve the walleye population. And after the bullhead removals, this is what we saw as far as walleye natural reproduction in Lake Matanga. As you can see, we consider 2008 kind of a intermediate or in-between year because the bullheads get removed after walleye spawning. So typically you don't see the impact until the year after. But after treatment, you can see we have a huge year class in 2009, followed by other very large year classes, upwards of 150 per mile. And again, we're just trying to make sure we hit that target of 20 per mile, which we did almost every year following that removal. In fact, we got such good natural reproduction that we stopped stocking walleyes at Lake Matanga after the 2012 stocking. We no longer needed to stock. Natural reproduction was taking care of the population on its own. And so when we look at the differences for pre and post removal during the non-stocked years where it's all naturally reproduced fish, we went from just under 3 per mile to an average of 45 per mile, more than double that benchmark I've been talking about. And our stocked year classes went from 13 per mile up to an average of almost 150 per mile. So we're looking at major increases to natural reproduction and stock survival of walleyes. And let's see what happened with the adult walleye population. Again, these are adult walleye population estimates during our spring surveys. And this is what the trend was happening prior to the bullhead removal. And after bullhead removal, we saw adult walleye abundance reach an all-time high. Obviously, those fish that have been reproducing are surviving and becoming adults in the system. And it's really creating a really high-quality walleye fishery on Lake Matanga. Here's the bullhead removal history by year. And you can see these initial removals from 2008 to 2010 removed the bulk, kind of handled the problem. And then from 2011 to 2017 is what we consider maintenance removals. And since 2017, bullheads have not been removed. And what we are seeing is we are seeing the population come back in Lake Matanga, and we're probably in need of some more maintenance removals going forward. But if you remember this kind of time series, the bulk of the removal happened in the late 2000s, and maintenance removals happened through 2017, and no removals since 2018. We're going to extend our our walleye recruitment graph to show how well walleyes naturally reproduced. And now I've added in the last few years, and this is without any removal. And we're seeing that walleye reproduction has gone down. So we had a very low level of natural reproduction. And then while removals were happening, we had a very high natural reproduction of walleyes. And now we're seeing low numbers again as the bullhead population is beginning to rise. And so this was the story of Lake Matanga. I looked at this data very early on, about 10 years ago when I arrived here, and instantly thought, hey, we might be onto something. So I looked at other lakes in my area that might be having the same issue going on with bullhead versus walleye. And that's how it led to my second project, which was on Patton Lake in Florence County. And here's Patton Lake, very different lake than Lake Matanga. It's 255 acres. It is a deep lake for its size. Most of the water is over 10 feet deep, has a sandy, gravelly substrate in most areas with some bays that have some more muck in them. But the water clarity is a little bit darker. It has a tint to it, unlike the really clear water that we had in Lake Matanga. And when I first got to Florence in 2010, fishermen and lake owners were complaining about really high bullhead abundance in Patton Lake and wondering if it was having a negative impact to their walleye fishery. And that's kind of how this project started. Again, it's another lake where you wouldn't expect bullheads to be very abundant, but they were in the case of Patton Lake. So the history, it's one of the walleye populations that we more recently started. We introduced walleyes to Patton Lake in 1974. There was 3 small stockings of small fingerling walleyes, which are about 1.5 inches to 2 inches long when we stocked them in June. We did that stocking 3 times, and walleyes began reproducing naturally. Became a very high density walleye population, the best walleye fishery in Florence County, and it maintained that way till about 2000. In 1993, we did a survey and we saw that walleyes were so abundant that they were reducing their growth rates and size structure was decreasing. And so we actually changed the size limit for walleyes on Patton Lake in 1997, and that's when we allowed more harvest from anglers. The walleye population started to decline, and at that same time, walleye reproduction began to decline and put us in a little bit of a sticky spot with walleye management on Patton Lake. 2011, I did a comprehensive survey on Patton Lake, and I was shocked to see that this best walleye fishery in the county had dropped below 1 adult per acre. And these fish that were in the population were not small fish. They were all very large, as you can see in that picture to the left. That's probably about a 27 or 28 inch pike on the top there. And when we'd empty a net, there would only be a few walleyes in them, and they would all be these really big old dinosaur walleyes. They're amazing fish and great to see, but it showed that, there wasn't a lot of walleyes coming up in the system, which always has you concerned as a fish manager. So if we look at the last 3 surveys, again, the 2011 survey that I did is in the bottom left, and you can see the length frequency of the walleyes handled. You can see that during that survey, we only handled 110 different walleyes, and the population estimate was under 1 adult per acre. When we look back to the 1993 survey, we had an adult estimate of 7 per acre, and we're handling almost 2,000 different walleyes in our nets. So major differences. And in 2004, the walleye population was sliding. We had a major reduction, but we were still at over 2 adults per acre. But the one thing that I want to point out here, we have walleye abundance going down through time from 93 to 2004 to 2011. But look at the size structure of these fish. When they were of really high abundance, basically more than half of the fish were under 15 inches. And it was really rare to see fish over 18 inches. As the abundance goes down, growth rates increase and we get better size structure. So by 2004, we had what would be considered a really nice size structure for walleyes, with probably 75% of the fish being over 15 inches and more evenly distributed. By the time we get to 2011, you can look at the scale on the y-axis. We're talking about just a few fish of each size, and it was pretty evenly distributed from about 13 inches all the way up to 30. So we saw a major change in the walleye fishery on Patton Lake, and there was no doubt something bad was happening out there. And here's the walleye abundance through time on Patton Lake. And again, in our naturally reproducing walleye populations, we're trying to maintain walleye abundance greater than 3 adults per acre. Patton's about 250 acres. So anything over here, over this level, would be considered, quality management. We're meeting our goals. By the 2000s, we started to not meet our goals, but we still had a desirable population. And by 2011, besides the chance to catch a real nice trophy walleye, there wasn't much going on in Patton Lake. When we look at walleye recruitment, this is a similar slide to what I showed you from Lake Matanga. Again, we're looking at this 20 fish per mile as the benchmark. And basically, if you get above 20 per mile, you're going to increase your adult walleye population with that year class. And in Patton Lake, we used to have this really strong recruitment. You can see all these years of over 100 per mile. And that's what drove that system and created the high density walleye population. The unfortunate thing is these 3 huge year classes from Patton, they never survived. They basically disappeared from the lake before they could be adults. And what we later found was that bullhead abundance had gone up to such a high level that it was impacting the survival of these juvenile fish, and then eventually stopping walleye natural recruitment almost altogether. And so that was kind of the why that we found when we looked at it through time. And as you can see, here is just looking at bullhead abundance in all the lakes that we've done spring pike net surveys in the last decade in Florence and Forest County. So you can see there's most lakes don't really have much of a bullhead population. We get over to Patton Lake, we're catching about 60 for every net that we lift. And this was even while we had been removing bullheads. So that was the average, even though we'd already removed about 1,500 adult bullheads from Patton Lake. So that was kind of the problem. You can see how it's an outlier along with a couple of these other lakes as far as being very abundant bullhead populations. So in 2011, you can see every red dot on this map shows where a net was put for Patton Lake. We tried to cover the entire lake and remove as many bullheads as we could. We spent a total of 254 net nights out there, which a net night is one net set for a 1 night period of time. So over this period, we had a 4-day period in the spring and an extended about 2.5 week period in the summer where we netted for bullheads and removed bullheads. We were very effective at catching and removing bullheads from Patton Lake. And these fish weren't all that big. They were ranging from about 7 to 10 inches, but they were very abundant. They were the most abundant fish species in Patton Lake in 2011. And you can see here's the biomass from a single net lift with 257 bullheads in it. They had just kind of overtaken the system, and they were the main fish as far as biomass and abundance goes, even more abundant than your typical panfish species like bluegills and perch. Bullheads were really driving the system. And so in total in 2011, we removed one fish shy of 6,000 bullheads from the system, which was about 24 fish per acre, and removed about 2,600 pounds of bullheads in 2011. And here is the bullhead removal history. You can see we removed that huge batch in 2011. We figured there was still a good population left. In 2012, we repeated the survey, and we barely caught any bullheads. They were basically gone after one event, and they were held down. So one of the things that we realized from Patton Lake was that you can exploit bullheads, and it is possible to keep their abundance down and keep them from coming back up. And in Patton Lake, the reason why we were able to keep their abundance down is because we had a very dedicated lake association there. We permitted them to act as agents of the state when bullheads huddled near shore, which typically occurs in middle of June to middle of July. And you can see these black balls near shore on the rocks. Those are schools of young of the year, recently hatched bullheads. They would take dip nets and seines and they'd net them out, and they would remove, some years they would remove up to 35,000 of these young of the year bullheads. So without the lake association basically being on patrol out there and removing the new recruits, the population would have likely rebounded and became abundant again. But they did great work out there, keeping the abundance in check, and we haven't had to do a major removal since that 2011 removal. So let's look at what the impacts of that removal were. So we went back 5 years later, and we repeated some of the surveys to look at bluegill or bullhead abundance. And based on our spring netting data, which is what we are our early spring, which we call an SN1, we estimate that we've removed 99.6% of the adult bullheads. And based on our late spring, which happens in late May, early June, the estimate is that we've removed about 97% of that population. So a major impact. We went from them being the most abundant fish species in Patton Lake and controlling basically all the biomass to a complete background species where they're actually really hard to find out there. And so this is the walleye recruitment data that I showed. Again, 2011 was when we removed the bullheads. We'll call that kind of an in-between year because bullheads were still present. The year that we removed them, with 2012 being the year that we would start seeing impacts from the bullhead removal. So we're going to look at walleye recruitment, and again, we have a scale change. So keep in mind that what we're trying to achieve is about 20 per mile or more once every 5 years to maintain a population. and here's what happened after the bullhead removal. As you can see, walleye reproduction went sky high. And again, we were starting with a very low amount of adult walleye, so there are very few walleyes in there to reproduce and create more walleyes. But we see walleye reproduction start to ramp up. And then by 2015, we had a major year class. And then these last 4 years, especially the last 3, it's just been off the charts recruitment. Each of these last 3 years, 2018, 19, and 20, Patton Lake has had the highest amount of walleye reproduction within the entire ceded territory, which is roughly the northern third of Wisconsin. So 3 years in a row, more juvenile walleyes created in Patton Lake than any of those other lakes that have been monitored in the ceded territory. So again, I'm going to go back to the slide one more time. So it takes about 3 years for a male walleye to become sexually mature, and it takes about 4 or 5 for a female walleye to become sexually mature. And so in 2011 is when we noticed the problem. 2016 was when we went back to evaluate it. So by 2016, we would have had adult males from 2013, 2012, and 2011 in the population, and probably only females from that 2011 event. So only 5 years after, we're looking at the adult population. Most of this recruitment hasn't entered the system yet, and this is what happened with the adult abundance. We got the adult abundance doubled over that 5 years, with only a couple year classes of primarily males becoming sexually mature. We'll be back in there this spring, and it'll be 10 years after the removal started. And we're expecting some really good things because we'll be able to see fish from these large year classes in our nets. So we're hoping to have a really high adult walleye population estimate. This project has worked out just phenomenally. Looking at other species in Patton Lake, because again, we have a pre-survey where we monitored every species of fish in the lake in 2011, and we have a 5-year post-survey in 2016. Bullhead abundance went way down. We saw largemouth bass abundance go up, but surprisingly, when you look at it from 2011 to 2016, this is the size of the individuals that we handled during our survey. Abundance went up, but as you can see, recruitment, or the amount of natural reproduction, seems to have gone down. We have very few small fish in the system. Most of what's in there is just things that were in the, or fish that were in the system in 2011, just growing up and becoming mature. So it looks like even though bass abundance has went up about 16%, largemouth bass recruitment's gone down, and we expect the largemouth bass population to go down quite drastically. Smallmouth bass abundance went up, and with that, we did not see the same trend or the issue with no recruitment. Smallmouth bass abundance is just going up across the board. We saw northern pike abundance go from probably the most abundant northern pike population in Florence County, and it got cut almost in half over just that 5-year time period. And a lot of these, phenomena are kind of hard to explain because you have all these adults in the system. Well, where do they go? How does the removal of a fish species like a bullhead reduce the abundance of northern pike? And so all of this data left a lot of questions on what are the mechanisms behind this and how is this happening? Similar with bluegill. In a 5-year period, after removing bullheads that you would think, if bullheads are having any impact on bluegills, they're probably eating some of them, maybe reducing their abundance. Well, it turns out you remove the bullheads from the population, and we have this major decline of almost 90% in bluegill abundance in Patton Lake. Pumpkin seed abundance, boom, they vanished. And when we look at our fall surveys that are looking at recruitment of these different fish species, after the bullhead removal, what we saw was a pretty good spike in perch recruitment. And we also saw black crappie recruitment popping up. So there weren't very big populations of perch or black crappie in the system prior to the bullhead removal. And now we see them as coming onto the scene as maybe the most abundant fish species in Patton Lake. So when we look at it across the board, remember this largemouth bass abundance went up, but we expect it to come back down because they're not reproducing the way they should. Bluegill abundance and northern pike abundance way down, walleye abundance and smallmouth bass positive, and we're seeing great responses by yellow perch and black crappie. Moving on to our next, and I don't have a time on my screen, so I'm going to look. Okay, it's 11:30. So moving on to our next one. After seeing the successes of Lake Matanga and successes of Patton Lake, I really wanted to try and see if this really was kind of a golden ticket for walleye management. So Crane Lake is connected to Pickerel Lake, all in total probably about 1,700 acres of water, really high bullhead abundance, but also probably the most abundant bluegill population in both of the counties that I have, really overabundant populations where we've struggled to manage bluegills and keep their abundance low enough that they weren't stunting out, and really high abundances of largemouth bass and northern pike. So this was kind of a test to see if it worked, and neither one of these lakes had had any walleye natural reproduction since the early 1980s. So we were trying to test it out on lakes that you wouldn't necessarily think are going to be great walleye lakes and see what happens when we remove bullheads from these lakes. So walleye were introduced into Crane Lake in 1941. It quickly became a really great walleye lake. It was one of the most fished walleye lakes, had a high density in the 4 to 8 per acre range through the 1970s. And then from 1980 on, we weren't getting any more natural reproduction, and our stocked walleyes weren't surviving, which caused a similar problem like we've seen in a lot of our walleye lakes. And walleye abundance just kind of crashes. So it was a really high abundance population historically, and now we were struggling to even get stocked fish to survive. And when we looked at the bullhead abundance, now this is from a different type of survey than the one I showed you on Patton. This is for a late May netting survey, and so all the lakes in the last decade that have been surveyed in my 2 counties, you can see Crane Lake has the highest bullhead abundance, followed by Pickerel Lake, which is also connected to Crane Lake. So this is all kind of one system. And so we saw this really high bullhead abundance, and that's why we wanted to kind of test our hypothesis on Crane Lake. So in 2013, we did the same thing we did as in Patton Lake. And we didn't do Pickerel Lake yet. We just wanted to focus on the smaller of the 2 lakes so we could, handle it a little easier and kind of test it out. But we loaded the lake up with nets. We ran nets for 2 weeks, removing bullheads. And over that time period, removed almost 8,400 bullheads. So again, 25 fish per acre, which was about the same level that we removed from Patton Lake. These fish were a little larger, and it was almost 20 pounds per acre. So we removed about 20 pounds of bullheads, which are predatory fish, from each acre of water in Crane Lake. So enough to cause a drastic change. And we looked at the next year, we came back kind of like in Patton, and we wanted to see how many were left. And so we set a bunch of nets in the exact same locations. And after 1 year, basically our data suggested that we had removed about 86% of the bullhead population from Crane Lake. And when we look at it after we've had further surveys after the removal, looking at 2017, when we look to see what impact our removal has had on the bullhead population out there, you can see that it also estimates very close to that 86 percentile. So we're removing the vast majority of these bullheads from Crane Lake. And here's the bullhead removals. Again, 2013 was where we did our major removal. 2014, we did our check back, and the population was down, and so we removed less. And then in 2017, we came back and did more removals. We didn't knock the population down as low as it was in Patton Lake, and we also didn't have the Lake Association patrolling and removing those young of the year fish. So we did see a little flare up in bullheads, or at least them maintaining an abundance where they were part of the fish community throughout the process, but major reduction nonetheless. And our preliminary results, now we haven't had as much time to let this play out in Crane Lake, so we don't have the results that we have from Matanga or Patton, but we looked at the stock survival of walleyes. And again, they weren't surviving very well, barely maintaining a population around 1 adult per acre. And so we stocked, in 2016, we stocked 3,500 large fingerling walleyes. The following spring, I did a population estimate on that year class of fish, and it showed that we still had almost 1,200 left. So we had 33% survival of our stocked fish, which had previously been, below 5% as far as stocking success. So walleyes are starting to survive. And here's the other. Remember what happened on Patton Lake, and we saw that major reduction in bluegills, and we saw largemouth bass stop reproducing. Now, we don't have all the pre-data that we had on Patton. We really only have good estimates on largemouth bass and panfish, but what we saw, again, was a reduction in largemouth bass abundance, even though during this time we're protecting largemouth bass with an 18-inch minimum size limit. And we saw bluegills, again, really abundant. This is a lake that has a history of overabundant bluegills. We saw that bluegill population of adult bluegills in a 5-year time period reduce by basically the exact same percentage as Patton Lake, 86–87%. So just by removing bullheads, the largemouth bass population is declining, the bluegill population is declining, just like Patton Lake. And we also have some other species that we can look at, but we didn't have pre-data on them. And all of a sudden, just like Patton Lake, yellow perch are now coming on very strong. They were the second most abundant fish species in Crane Lake when they were not very abundant prior to the bullhead removal. We then took this one step further in March of 2019, and we constructed a walleye spawning reef on Crane Lake, which, again, we haven't had natural reproduction on Crane Lake since, I believe, 1983. We built this spawning reef, and here's a picture of Mike Proyle, the biologist from Mole Lake, who was the person who deserves the credit for starting these bullhead removals. He did that on Lake Matanga. We got Brad, who was a major player in the Lake Association, and we installed this rock reef, and we found natural reproduction that same year that we installed the rock reef. So we've now returned natural reproduction back to Crane Lake. Pickerel Lake, which is the connected lake and the larger of the two, this one is very shallow, very weedy. It is probably more in line with a lake that you would expect to have high bullhead abundance. It used to have oxygen issues, and aeration units been installed. We don't have any fish kills happening anymore, but bullheads, which are tolerant of low oxygen, are present, and they're very abundant. So this is probably the first lake where you'd expect there to be a lot of bullheads. And again, just like Crane Lake, even more so than Crane Lake, overabundant bluegills, largemouth bass, northern pike dominated system, and we're trying to manage for walleye. We want to see if removing bullheads from this lake can instantly turn things into a more productive walleye fishery. We're really trying to test our hypothesis on probably some of the lakes that are least likely to see walleye success. And since it's connected to Crane Lake, it has the same history. We introduced walleyes in 1941. It maintained a solid walleye abundance through the 70s. We have no documentation of natural reproduction on Pickerel Lake, but while Crane Lake was reproducing at high levels, it would spill over into Pickerel and maintain a very good walleye population. And then from 1995 on, almost no survival of stocked walleyes, very low adult abundance. In fact, in 2017, when we did a walleye population estimate, it was the lowest abundance of walleyes ever seen in a lake managed for walleyes within the ceded territory. So that's how bad this lake is struggling from a walleye standpoint. And again, I showed you that Pickerel Lake, which is connected to Crane, also has this extraordinarily high bullhead abundance. And so in 2014, the year after Crane Lake, we started a bullhead removal, and the Mole Lake Chippewa community jumped in, and we put 50 pike nets out in Pickerel Lake and ran them for a period of over 2 weeks here. And with a total of over 500 net nights, 481 directed at Pickerel with some directed at Crane net nights. So we really hit it with a lot of gear going after the bullheads in Pickerel Lake because it is such a large water. It's 1,300 acres. The majority of it is very shallow and weedy. So there's really almost anywhere where these bullheads can be. And it proved to be a little problematic for us to be able to remove a high number of bullheads to make the significant impact that we had on Lake Matanga, Patton Lake, and Crane Lake. And this was an interesting bullhead that we captured. And in fact, it was so unique, I decided that we were going to save this fish, and I brought it back to, I have a 600-gallon aquarium in my office, and I put that unique colored bullhead into my aquarium. And when I removed it from Pickerel Lake and placed it in the aquarium, it instantly turned back to the normal color that a bullhead is. I was shocked. It didn't stay like that for very long. So in 2014, again, this wouldn't have happened without cooperation from the Lake District. The Lake District was set up with all these different tubs. I would call them on my cell phone. When our tubs were getting full, they'd back down. We would load all the bullheads into their tubs. They'd take them to a site off of the lake where people could then come up and pick up bullheads for human consumption. And in total, we removed about 11,000 bullheads in 2014, which was only about 8 per acre. And again, we removed 25 per acre in Crane and 25 per acre in Patton. So we did not have the drastic impact on pickerel, mainly because of the way the lake is laid out. Just being very large, shallow lake, we weren't able to get at a high number of those fish. But we did see bullhead abundance go down during our removal, but still at a rate where we would consider them an abundant fish species. So we knew that more work was going to have to be done on pickerel in order to see this removal. I kind of consider this like a half removal, the 2014 removal. And then in 2017, we went back and removed almost the exact same number of bullheads. And so grand total, we removed about 22,000 bullheads over those 2 main years. And we've reduced their abundance down to a more normal level, maybe not the drastic impact we had on Crane, Matanga, and Patton, but it was a very drastic removal after these 2 events were completed. And here's the history of removal. Again, the 2 big events in 2014 and 2017. And then we've been supplementing it with maintenance removals in other years. But our pre-data was gathered in 2012 before the removals. And then we went back in 2017 in the spring. So prior to the second wave of removals, where we basically only had about a half removal done. And this is what we saw on Pickerel Lake. And remember, dominant largemouth bass, very abundant northern pike population, and overly abundant bluegill population. And what we saw was, again, this reduction in largemouth bass, even though they're protected from anglers with an 18-inch size limit. And we saw the same drastic decrease in bluegill abundance of 91% on a lake that we've always struggled to reduce the bluegill population. We had a high size limit on walleyes and largemouth bass, abundant pike population. We could never reduce their population so that they could grow better. And just by removing the bullheads from the equation, their abundance basically drops and they start to disappear from the situation. And again, very abundant northern pike population. And this is only after a half removal. And by this time in 2017, 3 years after the half removal, yellow perch had now become the most abundant fish species in Pickerel Lake. And so when I talk about fish communities in northern Wisconsin, on our smaller lakes, there's basically 2 types. There's these group A's, which have yellow perch as the dominant panfish, smallmouth bass is the dominant bass. You'll probably have some northern pike, but they're not abundant. And in this group A system, walleye thrive. You'll either have natural reproduction or you'll have really good survival of stocked walleyes in a group A system. And what's been happening is a lot of these group A systems have been turning into group B systems, just like Crane, Pickerel, Patton. We've seen these systems switch from this fish community over to this fish community, but we've never been able to really revert them back. And so all of these lakes like Patton, Pickerel, and Crane had very high abundance of bluegills. Largemouth bass was the dominant fish species, or dominant bass species, and northern pike were the dominant game fish. And what we've seen after the removals, when we look at it, is we see walleye abundance increasing with removals, northern pike abundance decreasing. Again, we saw adult abundance of largemouth go up, but it was basically with juveniles that were already in the system, and recruitment had kind of dropped off, so we're expecting that to decrease. So we're seeing this reduction in largemouth bass. Where smallmouth bass are present, we're seeing an increase in their abundance, and we're seeing this bluegill reduction, major bluegill reduction in all of these lakes with the bullhead removal. And pumpkin seeds are also a population that is being reduced after we remove bullheads. So what we're seeing is we're moving these systems back with this bullhead removal, where they've slid from a group A system to a group B system. We're able to revert them back to a group A system just with the removal of bullheads. And I'm just checking my time. We got a few minutes left. We're going to go into, well, here's some prey items. So as we're removing the bullheads, we're throwing them in tubs. They're regurgitating food. And these are all in lakes where walleye abundance has been very low at the time of the removal, and recruitment has almost been gone. And what we're seeing coming out of them are perch and walleyes. And these are systems where it's really hard to find a walleye. So further research, this kind of spun off, and there's a graduate student named Logan Sikora who is working on a bullhead removal project on another Forest County lake, Howell Lake. And his advisor, Dr. Vandehay at Stevens Point, Dr. Sass with the DNR, and myself and Mike Proyle with the tribe have collaborated on this project, and this will be getting published this year in the North American Journal of Fish Management. So now we're going to switch gears from bullhead removals to a little more controversial, a removal of largemouth bass. And so Jungle Lake, just under 200 acres in Forest County, very shallow lake. Again, a lake you might not think to be a walleye lake, but it was probably the most productive walleye lake in northern Wisconsin for more than a decade. And as you can see, the adult walleye abundance was in this 8 to 15 adults per acre from the late 90s into the late 2000s. But then we see the adult population start to drop. Same thing we saw in Patton Lake, Pickerel Lake, Crane Lake, Matanga. And we're seeing the natural reproduction of walleyes. Again, here's the 20 mark where we like to see that'll improve a fishery. We had really great reproduction and now almost non-existent from 2006 on. So it kind of, it's kind of the age-old debate. What came first, the chicken or the egg here? What do we need to do to improve the walleye population in Jungle Lake? And it's very clear to see out there where we did still have a high adult stock. We're seeing where walleye recruitment is starting to drop down. Our adult abundance is dropping down the same way. So we need to increase walleye recruitment, which is kind of the key on all of this. And during this time period where walleye abundance is dropping, and again, this is a lake that was a walleye factory for many years, and it got lots of walleye surveys. We didn't really look at largemouth abundance in Jungle Lake, so we only have this relatively new data. But back when walleyes were thriving, largemouth bass were a background species. And by 2010 and 2013, we're seeing this increasing largemouth bass abundance at an extremely high rate, 8 to 10 adults per acre. And we saw that come on the scene. And so we started a walleye rehabilitation plan in 2013. And I'm going to start talking fast so we have some time for some questions. But basically, our goal was to flip this system like we did with the bullhead removals from a largemouth bluegill population back to a perch and walleye population, with goals of over 4 adults per acre for walleyes, bringing back natural reproduction, reducing largemouth bass reproduction, and moving this fish back manually by removing largemouth bass. And our target population of largemouth bass was 1.5 per acre. And then we wanted to document what happened during this project. Is it something that'll work just like the bullhead removals? Is it something we can roll out on a higher level? And then we were also going to stock walleyes in Jungle Lake because it hadn't reproduced in a while. But we're going to take the eggs from Jungle Lake and raise them up from the same wild fish that were in Jungle Lake. And then we were going to reduce the harvest of walleyes by increasing the minimum size limit on walleyes, decreasing the minimum size limit on largemouth, and the tribe volunteered to reduce spear harvest. So during the first 3 years of removal, we removed about 15 adults per acre from the system, which was more than we originally thought were in the system. We thought we had it on track. Here's kind of a time series of largemouth abundance. We went from, at the start of the project, 9 per acre, and by the end of the first year, we had removed it down to about where our goal was, which was 1.5 adults per acre. Removal still continued out to 2016, but only on the adults. And when we started in 2016, we found that we had even more largemouth bass, adult largemouth bass present than before we removed 15 per acre. And what happened there was we weren't removing the juvenile fish. We were only removing adults. They began to reproduce at higher levels, and they had this compensatory response where then when all of these 3-year-old largemouth came on the scene and they were sexually mature, we had a higher abundance than even when we started with. So at this point in time, we started removing fish using mini Pike nets to remove the juvenile age 0 largemouth. We've done that from then on, and now we've been able to get the adult population down to 1.5 per acre, which was our target goal. And here's a total largemouth bass removal. Remember, this is only a 180-acre lake. We removed almost 8,000 largemouth bass throughout this project. So we've removed almost more, or kind of more biomass per acre from Jungle Lake than we removed from our bullhead removal projects. On top of that, the Mole Lake tribe stocked Jungle Lake strain walleyes a number of years to maintain the population. We reduced the largemouth bass size limit, so there's no minimum, and we protected walleyes under an 18-inch minimum. So you could say more drastic activity happened during this removal process than the other ones, because we didn't change size limits on the other removals. We removed more fish or more largemouth bass here than we did with bullheads on a per acre basis. And we also reduced tribal harvest. You can see at the start of the project, tribal harvest, they decided they were not going to spear and harvest any walleyes out of Jungle Lake to give it the best chance of survival. And what have we seen so far? This is the walleye recruitment going back. Again, we see it drop down. And from the start of the project, what we've seen is basically we had 1 year class, but these were fish that, this was a year that we stocked fish in the spring. And so these stocked fish survived well, and it's not natural reproduction. And basically natural reproduction staying very insignificant. Remember, we need to get to that 20 per mile benchmark to have a solid year class. And after all of this work, we have not brought back significant natural reproduction to Jungle Lake. Adult walleye abundance, so looking at the adult fish, the sexually mature fish, you can see it was declining. We've been able to stabilize that population, but again, we got an 18-inch size limit on it. There's no tribal harvest occurring, and we're stocking fish. So we've basically been able to maintain a fishable population, enough adults to pull off natural reproduction if it were to happen, but we're not seeing any walleye reproduction. And while we see this, remember the results from the bullhead removals, we've seen bluegill abundance skyrocket to almost out of control levels. We've seen yellow perch abundance skyrocket too, which is a good thing. That's one of the species that coexist well with walleyes, and it's hard to have a good walleye population without a perch population. And so this is probably the biggest positive that we've seen. We have a much better perch population than we've ever had. Black crappie abundance is also increasing. We're seeing northern pike abundance increase. So when you look at these group A and group B species, and we're trying to shift from a group B back to a group A, yes, we have an increase in perch population. Walleyes have basically stayed the same, but we've had to stock them to maintain that. And smallmouth bass are not present in this system, but we've seen bluegill abundance skyrocket, northern pike abundance go up, and yes, largemouth bass abundance has gone down, but not willingly. We've had to remove that. So much different results than we've seen from the bullhead removals. And I have the next one I just want to touch on, and I had some slides, but I'm not even going to really present on it, is a new project that we're doing on Roberts Lake. It has a very similar project or problem where walleye abundance is going down, walleye recruitment has gone way down. You can see from an average of over 40 young of the year per mile down to an insignificant level. We have perch abundance going way down. I'll remove that outlier, and you can see this went from a perch factory down to a very bad perch population. Muskie abundance is going down, which are we've always managed this lake for muskies, walleyes, yellow perch, and smallmouth. And muskie reproduction stopped, and we ended up with this fish community dominated by largemouth bass and northern pike, and the species that we are managing for are of very low abundance. And so we started a project where we're removing northern pike and largemouth bass to try to make this flip, and we'll see what happens on Roberts Lake. Will it be the same as Jungle Lake, where we seem to not be able to reach our goals? Will it have a good impact like we've seen with the bullhead removals? We just don't know. And with that, I think I have about 5 minutes for some questions. I'm sorry for having to speed through at the end there.
Thank you, Greg. Really interesting talk. I've learned a lot. And yeah, we do have some questions here and just a few minutes to ask, so I'll get right into them. This is a question I had as well. Why were the bullheads interfering with the walleye production? Are they eating the eggs, or are they eating the fry, or what's going on there?
Well, and that's part of, you know, how I mentioned there is a project going on with a grad student and a publication that'll be coming out this year. They wanted to look more at the mechanisms. What lever is being turned or pushed to make this happen? But what we do know is that they will basically eat anything they can wrap their mouths around. We did some preliminary diet work. There's a lot more diet work that'll come out of this Howell Lake study. But basically, they'll eat whatever they can. And predation of eggs is part of it. But they're also eating juvenile walleyes up to quite a large size.
Yeah, I saw that. Some of those in those pictures were bigger than I would have thought.
Yeah, and at one point, you know, this isn't very scientific, but I put about a dozen bullheads into my big aquarium at work, and I just threw about 15 walleyes in there, ranging in size from probably about 7 inches up to like 12 or 13 inches. You know, they're basically larger than the bullhead, the large ones. When I came back the next day, every walleye was dead. So even though they didn't consume most of them, they basically wrapped their lips around its head, and they have such crushing jaws, they would just smash and crush the head of a walleye and just leave the carcass there, laying there on some of the bigger ones. So, but I also have a hypothesis that it has a lot to do with crayfish. Seems like a lot of their diet where crayfish are in the system are crayfish. And when you remove crayfish from a system, you increase aquatic vegetation and you increase water clarity, which benefits bluegills and largemouth bass. And when you have more crayfish in the system, you have less plants, water clarity goes down, which benefits the yellow perch and walleye. So there's a lot of mechanisms going on there, but it has direct predation and likely a crayfish component going on.
Sure. Okay, I want to just one more question quick. We have about a minute left here. Any concern with the lower panfish numbers after the bullhead removals on these lakes?
Well, you know, it was a big concern initially. We didn't know what was going to happen. I was shocked. I didn't see how you could take, you know, say you got 100 6 to 7 inch bluegills per net lift. You come back 5 years after a bullhead removal and you got 10. Where did all these fish go? You know, yeah, anglers are taking some, but they're not exploiting them at a 90% level. So there was some concern. What we've seen is really drastic increase in perch. And so we're basically replacing the pan fishery that was bluegill with yellow perch. They're growing really fast in all of these lakes. And there's a kind of a lag time where the pan fishing is not quite as good, but with perch coming up with it and then being a much better forage and better partner in a system with walleyes, no concerns from my standpoint, especially when the target is improving the walleye fishery. Great.
Okay, well, I think that's about all the time we have. If you still have questions for Greg, feel free to stop by his speaker platform and you can ask him there. Or I'm sure you can find him at the DNR somewhere. And I appreciate you being here, Greg, and I appreciate everybody who came to listen to this talk. And thank you all for a lovely morning here in the Habitat session.
Thank you very much.